So, Norman Wirzba, thanks very much for joining me on the Hermitix podcast.
Yeah, great to be with you, James.
We are going to be discussing your book, Love's Braided Dance, Hope in a Time of Crisis. This was published by Yale University Press. And this is a book, I'll keep it short on this one. This is a book about hope, how we understand hope, the place of hope within the modern world to a lesser degree, and really how we can have a re-understanding or a new understanding of hope that doesn't really change it in a way that falls into pessimism or falls into the stereotypical form of hope that we've come to sort of know in our modern age. I hope I've sort of done your book justice. It's a very accessible book filled with stories. It's a very easy read, very enjoyable read. So before we get into it, just Norman, tell us a little bit about yourself, what it is you do, and why hope? Why this book?
So I'm a professor at Duke University. I have been teaching in philosophy, theology, environmental studies for many years now. And at Duke, I've been working primarily out of the Divinity School, trying to help people understand theological concepts around creation, around what it means to be human living in this world today. But I've also become very involved in Duke University's sustainability and climate efforts because I'm now the director of research for the Office of Climate and Sustainability. And there, my work is primarily focused on trying to activate research across the university and the School of Medicine so that we can better understand what climate change represents and how we might also start to address it. I don't think anybody believes we're going to solve climate change, but we're definitely going to need to figure out ways to make life more livable for lots of communities that are already facing some pretty horrific events related to climate change, things like extreme weather events. We're having two of those in recent memory in North America with Hurricane Helene that came up the eastern coast into Appalachia, and then also the fires in Los Angeles. And there's just tremendous amount of suffering coming along for people. And this is just the North American context. So many other places in the world are facing really horrible, horrible situations. And so the work to try to address that is going to be enormous, and it's going to need to be interdisciplinary. And so I'm doing a lot of work to try to build bridges across disciplines. So that's sort of the context in which I'm working right now. And it's pretty heavy stuff. And so when I talk about it, I often get asked, well, what gives you hope? And I don't like that question, and you know that because you read the book. But I think the question, when it's put that way, can often get us into trouble because it makes hope seem like something that if you have, you're going to be immune to trouble. And so you could imagine it to be something like a vaccine that protects you from whatever illness you're most afraid of. And I think that's a mistake, because I don't think hope is about protecting yourself from trouble. Hope is about what activates you to enter into the trouble to become a source of healing and repair. And that's a vastly different way of sort of conceptualizing hope. And you asked about why did I write this book? And I think that there was a couple answers. One, first of all, just being around young people, I had learned that they are very suspicious of the term because they see how the term is used to pacify or evade responsibilities for the kind of world that we're in. When they say, just have hope, everything's going to be all right. They're not thinking everything's going to be all right. So that was one stimulus. And then the second one is that I was part of a working group of scholars from around the world who were looking at what Earth system scientists call our Anthropocene moment, where we now, well, it's not a moment, it's a new epoch, where the world has changed fundamentally because of human power. And the question is whether or not we need to rethink basic categories that we have organized our cultures around. And so those were two sort of major stimuli for the book.
Hope isn't something you can have then. It's not a quantity.
No, it isn't, because then you have this terrible thing where some people say, well, I'm just hopeful, and other people say, well, I'm not. And then the question becomes, well, how do you get it? And, the temptation is to think that you could somehow get lucky or find yourself in the right situation and then suddenly you have it. Or if you're one of the people that have it, you're supposed to be the kind of person who will out of goodness of will or whatever, pass it on to somebody else. And I just don't think that hope works that way. And it's certainly not my experience or in my reading of people who I think are hopeful people, that that's how they understand what hope is. The idea that you could have hope is also something that just fits in beautifully with consumerism and that whole mentality, right? It's a commodity. You know, some people can have it, some people can afford to have it, and other people can't. And I think that's rubbish.
And well, also this is the I should say the reason that this chat came about is because I was put into contact with you via Kevin Hart, and me and Kevin often talk about the difference between apophatic theology and petitionary prayer, so asking and then not being able to define. And it seems that what you're gesturing towards is something akin to an apophatic or a hope via negativa, a hope that is a quality to be found, but when you say, I have this, I've grasped onto something, well, it can't be that, because you can't put your hope on something that is, as you just mentioned, something akin to spiritual consumerism.
Yeah. I mean, there can be a lot of presumption in the ways that we talk about hope, especially if we think of hope as something that is what I would call much more akin to optimism. This idea that things are going to work out in the end, it's all going to be all right. We don't exactly know how, but trust us, it's going to be okay. I think that too is a very dangerous way of speaking, because what's very clear is that the systems that we're being asked to give our confidence to are just doing so much damage in our world. And so to say that the systems are basically okay is a refusal to, first of all, see clearly what's going on in the world. And it's also a refusal to ask basic questions about the justice or the beauty or the goodness of the systems that are in place. So that's a real problem, in my view, that we could think that if we just say, hang on, things are going to work out in the end. I just don't think that's true. The other thing, and this relates more directly to the apophaticism that you just mentioned, is that to talk the way that, we would say, hey, just be confident, it's going to be okay, is it presumes that we know enough. And we don't know enough, right? We're ignorant about so much about our world. We're ignorant about so many Earth system processes still. We're doing, a lot of good work understanding Earth systems and meteorological systems and things of that sort. But there's still so much that we cannot comprehend. We're still working at apprehending. So if we can't comprehend so much, for us to rely on our predictive power is, I think, really, really dangerous. And the area where I think this is especially pronounced and also deeply problematic is the growing enthusiasm around AI, which seems to be resting on this presumption that more information is better, and the more information we have, the more readily we will solve our most basic problems. And that just seems to me to be a false assumption, because we're living in a world with more information than ever, and it's not doing us a lot of good. In fact, it's creating contexts of tremendous misunderstanding and deception. And what is so crucially absent in our quest for data, ever bigger data sets and data centers and all the problems that they present, and then all the algorithms that will be applied to the data, is that that's resting upon what in philosophy we call just this basic thing called information. It's not yet even knowledge, let alone wisdom, which is what we really need.
One of the great errors of the modern world is to conflate description with prescription, right? And no amount of that ever seems to prescribe anything. But to prescribe, you have to have those foundational values that you mentioned, that for many people, and I, over the years since my forays in pessimistic French thought and very modern thought, I've come around to just accepting that beauty and goodness do exist. Without those principles, to prescribe is generally a bit of a mess, but they are there. But I do just want to jump back to, do you feel that the reason hope has become somewhat of a dirty, or at the very least a word of suspicion, is that it is utilized by those very systems that are making the world hopeless? They use it as a means to kick the can down the road.
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. And we see this at, the world's big international fora, right? You can think here either of Davos in Switzerland when the world leaders come and business leaders come, or you can think about the various COP meetings that have been going on each year in different countries. And when you go to one, and I've been to the one in Scotland, and it was in many respects fairly depressing because you see the world there divided into two big sort of groupings. One is the group that has all the suits and all the money and all the influence, and they're meeting inside the convention halls and they're squabbling about how little they want to have to pay to address the problem, how little they want to have to change the status quo to solve the problem. And then outside, you have this other very, very large group of mostly young, often indigenous people who are more like community activists, faith leaders. And those are the folks who are saying we need a dramatically different world. And they don't have power, they don't have money, but they're the ones who are actually talking about the need to adjust the systems, because the systems that got us here are not going to be the same systems that get us out, right? That's a fundamental assumption. And what's so troubling to me is to hear these leaders who have the suits and the money and the power telling all the other folk, all the young people, don't worry, it's going to be all right. Trust us. Don't give up on hope. And what the young people want to say to these leaders, and quite rightly, is no, what you are protecting is precisely what is creating the condition for hopelessness, the condition for despair. Because what you understand to be success, which in most instances means, growth of economies, growth of wealth, rests upon growing inequality, rests upon ecological degradation, rests upon the further dehumanization of peoples. And so don't ask us to have hope in a system that is benefiting you, but doing so much damage to the vast majority of people.
Why can those people not see?
Because money is a blinding force, right? When you have a lot of money, you are trained not to see things, not just because of your location, right? That you don't ever get near poverty, but you have to also be blind to the systems that are making you so wealthy by covering over, neglecting the very sort of adverse consequences that follow from your system. So, the fact that we've got right now in the United States a government which is going to be populated by a lot of billionaires is deeply troubling to me, because just to give one example, the founder of OpenAI, Sam Altman, he is one among many of these Silicon Valley billionaires who is saying, oh, just trust us. AI is going to be so great because what it's going to do is it's going to liberate people from the work that they find so onerous, and they'll be able to live sort of creative lives of leisure. And it's just so ridiculous because he's a billionaire, and if he doesn't work, he can have a life of leisure. But he's so out of touch with the lives of ordinary people, many of whom absolutely depend upon a job to have a minimal paycheck so they can have food on the table. You take their job away, they're not looking at a life of leisure. They're looking at a life of desperation, right? And these people are completely blind to those kinds of realities because, as I said, they're either, physically located behind, gated communities, living in very elite circles, but they're also blind because the system that makes the wealth for them also hides from them the adverse effects of their progress.
And yet, ironically, I would argue that they're not really living. They're not really engaged with life. There is some other force there that they are trying to bolster or...
Yeah, I mean, I can't claim to understand the mentality, but it's just puzzling to me that you've got people who are billionaires and yet want to make more, not just want, but actually feel they need to make more. I mean, how much money do you need to make before you can say, I think that's enough? And I don't think that that's a conversation that even enters into the mindsets of these people, because I think we're in this process or in this cultural period where the drive to maximize and optimize and the speed by which we need to do both of those things is just soul destroying. It's life denying. And when you're caught up in it, you're not even aware of it, I don't think. Or maybe you are, but you're just really good at hiding it from yourself.
Well, there's two sort of camps of people there. There's those that would have the makeup of all sorts, spiritual, social, familial, historical, whatever my cultural makeup, to be able to say, yeah, I've had enough. Fine with my lot in life. There are those that would go on infinitely, and I guess those in the former camp are never going to become billionaires because, well,
Yeah.
I always think the same thing about a lot of things. I mean, why don't you just stop and, I don't know, go sit by the river? But it's a sort of a category leap where I don't think you can fully understand it, but it does, I think, bring about a certain difference. You mentioned something that I think is very key in this day and age that I'm pessimistic about in one sense, but it's the life denying. And so there's sort of three factors in your book. I mean, of course you have hope, but then you have hope's relation to one's relation to either life affirming or life denying. And then alongside this is this, what we'll get to, a relationship to love. But we are from this hope, this false hope that has been bolstered by this complete distrust of hope, that feeds into a culture that is life denying, that if there is no such thing as hope, life becomes a mere Sisyphean drudgery, right? You just keep going. It's not anything to be enjoyed, not anything beautiful.
Yeah.
So what do you think the connection there is with, because you say on page 10, hope has no future apart from a skilled and practiced cherishing of life. Not many people around anymore cherishing life.
Right.
Quite literally in the UK. I mean, we just had the bill to kill it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I can't claim to understand all the factors that are motivating the ways people behave in this world, but I think right now there's a sense that people feel that they're behind, and they are behind. I mean, the rates of inequality are at all-time highs. And so there is this relentless push to either catch up or excel. And in that push, you decide that you have to be single-minded in your focus, high energy octane life to just achieve.
Mm-hmm.
And when you do that, when you make that commitment, and especially if you don't have people around you saying, wait a minute, why are you making that choice? It's very easy, I think, to get lost, right? And so just to give a sort of simple, small-scale example that I can relate to, I teach at a university like Duke, which is a high-octane place, right? You don't get to be at Duke by being a slacker. The trouble is that you can simply say, I'm going to work all the time so that I can match the productivity levels of my colleagues. And in that very simple desire to sort of keep up or maybe exceed what your other colleagues are doing, you decide, I'm not going to have a dinner with friends, or I'm not going to take a vacation, or I can work just a little bit longer. And slowly what happens is that you lose touch with your family, you lose touch with your friends, you lose touch with your community, you lose touch with your neighborhood, because the minute you wake up, you're already obsessed with productivity.
Yeah.
And you stay up late because it's about productivity. And there's a kind of narrowing of your vision. There's a narrowing of your sympathies that happens in processes like that. And that's just one example. I mean, the other one that you would obviously need to get to, which is a very different one than mine, where I'm, in an elite institution, right? Think about the legions of people who through social economic circumstance find themselves in positions of poverty, right? To ask them to think about cherishing when they are having to work 3 jobs just so that they can make it, just so they can have rent that they can pay, right? There's a kind of desperation that these people feel, where to say to them, hey, why don't you do some cherishing of life? They'll look at you with a kind of dumbfounded expression, because they'll say, you have no idea what kinds of realities I'm facing. And so that's a very different way, I think, in which people can become increasingly distanced from or even numb to the world around them, because there's too many pressures, there's too many anxieties, there's too much worry. And when you've got all that going on, the prospect of taking the time to notice and to cherish, it's really hard to come by.
I mean, there's a key word there that you mentioned that does come up in your book a few times, and I think it's a very acute perspective. It's very on what you say on page 21. The opposite of joy isn't sadness; it is numbness and the erosion of the yearning for intimacy. And so, modern, stereotypically disenchanted secular man, or this sort of new last man, I guess Nietzsche would say, isn't necessarily. It's not with this world without that genuine hope, the quality of hope that you're trying to gesture towards in this book, without love as well. This isn't necessarily its opposite. It's not always simply the competitive, volatile, hateful, or angry. It's not that. Usually, and this is at least what I see, as you've pointed out, it's a numbness. It is some ontology that, in being numb, to use that metaphor, no longer. Not that it doesn't let things in, it can't, because it doesn't even know it's there. It just nothing penetrates it anymore. No feeling, no love, especially. I mean, love is the best topic. So.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're describing something really important. I think what I would add to it is this dimension of time, right? Being able to cherish life means you need to be able to come into the presence of it with attention. And how do you do that when time is something you don't have? Either because you are being driven by external factors, or you're being driven by internal factors that propel you down channels, down pathways that they're not of your choosing. And the timing of your movement along those pathways is also not of your choosing, because you've got mandates you have to fulfill. And those can be externally imposed, or they can be internally imposed, these mandates. And as long as you are in a sort of a situation like that, where you're constantly pressed for time, how are you going to cherish? Right? So, I dedicated the book to our granddaughter, Lila. So she lives close by, which is the most wonderful thing. And for me, the question is, when she comes over, do I make the time to be with her? Because you can't just see her for 5 minutes and say, yeah, I've cherished you, I'm done, and now I get on with my work, right? You have to come into a space where she can recognize that you are giving her attention, that you are recognizing her as a distinct individual that has certain characteristics, certain personality traits, and you need to learn them, and you need to recognize that they're constantly changing. And even something like cherishing your granddaughter is so easy to let slide, let alone cherishing friends, right? If you're going to cherish your friends, you got to be with them. You got to understand what's going on in their world. And that means you have to make time for them. And that's something I think that is really hard for people to do. And, we can get into, some of the sort of cultural factors about that. But I think it's very clear that in our world today, so many people feel stressed because they're caught in these traps of optimization, but they also feel incredibly lonely and disconnected from those around them who would be the sources or the focus of their cherishing.
Well, this links back to something you've already said, which is, we're sort of talking around something that really is directionality, because you've spoken about this idea of next best thing, optimization. We've got to progress, how to be productive. This is all a single linear direction, the one direction that we've all apparently agreed upon. And the reasons it seems that people are lonely is that, well, if you're there, you're not here now. You're not enjoying anything now. You're thinking about, okay, next job, next thing, whatever it might be. That is the direction that everyone is heading, is one where they are simply not. It's they exist only in the next iteration of themselves that doesn't exist yet.
Yeah.
What would you, if you want to go with that metaphor of direction, what are the directions, the other directions one could move in or move within or with, that are conducive to this quality of hope that you want to bring about?
Yeah. Well, I think one way to put it would be, instead of looking constantly forward, I think there's also something interesting to be said about looking constantly backward, but looking around, right? If that could be sort of the spatial orientation that would be recommended here. And that is something that, again, I think is something tricky for people, because to look around, you have to first of all realize that you don't often know exactly where you are. Because, we wake up and we've got our trajectory, we got our path, it's already laid out for us, and we get on that path and we go. We don't bother to look to the left or to the right. We don't bother to sort of do an assessment of the context that's making it possible for us to do the things that we do. And this is, I think, where community becomes very, very important. We need communities of people who come around us who will say to us, are you paying attention to the things that need paying attention to? Right? So here, I've got a family, I've got a wife, I've got people who will say, you're losing your way because you're making this the focus, and you shouldn't be making that the focus. You're forgetting the things that are really important in your world. And that, I think, is something that we're going to have to address a whole lot more in our culture. And that brings us back to something that we were talking about earlier, which is we have to figure out what's valuable, what's really meaningful. And that's a hard thing to do, because we have so many voices telling us what matters. The big one, obviously, being wealth accumulation, power, prestige, those kinds of things. When in fact, what we understand, and we got all kinds of social scientific literature to back this up, what really makes people happy is the quality of the relationships that they have. And so we have to ask ourselves, how have we traded quality relationships for the quantities of possessions or the quantities of power that we might be able to amass? That, I think, is going to be an important question for us.
This brings us, I mean, this is something I've been thinking about a lot recently. This brings us back to numbness, because you look at the history of philosophy, really, most people would say you have two paths, one of which is there is meaning in the world, which is either found in God or structured meaning, that whatever it might be, but there is meaning in the world. Then someone, I don't know, not Nietzsche possibly, but other people who are adjacent to nihilism, I'm not calling Nietzsche a nihilist, they would say there is no meaning in the world. I think there's a more intriguing third path, which is probably gestured towards in your book, and is definitely to do with numbness, which is there is meaning, but people just don't care about it because they've become so numb. And I think that's a different thing from there being no meaning. And so it's a different question than trying to create meaning or trying to refine the meaning that's been lost. Is one of, there is meaning everywhere and people are amidst it all the time. As you said about earlier, about the information, the abundance of information, you can find meaning constantly if you wanted to. Go outside and look at the flowers, or go look at that tree and talk about its taxonomies, but no one cares about meaning. And that seems to be key towards hope, which is just to care about it, even if it does die or whatever it might be, is to care about it.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. Let's sort of dig into this a little bit. I think you're right that we're living in varying states of what I might call oblivion, where we're mostly obtuse and ignorant about the conditions for our own existence. So let's use food as an example. Right? If you live today in the sort of elite world that many people are moving into, where you can have an iPhone or some other cellular device, and you can be sitting on your couch and you can order your food online, and the food will be delivered to your door. Okay, that's an incredible description of power that human beings have. And we love it because it's not just power that gives us exactly what we want. It's also power that comes at almost no real cost to us, because all you got to do is click a button and it's incredibly convenient. Okay. Now think about what that does to our relationship to food, right? What it means is that food is strictly a commodity, which is to be engaged in terms of convenience, in terms of cheapness, in terms of how it helps us feel good or whatever, or a status symbol even. I mean, there's lots of ways that it now registers. But what that means is you really have no appreciation for what food is, right? Which means that food has lost its sense of being a beautiful, delicious, fragile, vulnerable reality that is also miraculous. Because think, you have to grow food to eat food. But how many people understand anything about the processes of growth, which include processes of decomposition and death, but also germination and fruitfulness, right? Eating depends upon incredible marvels that you will only understand if you're engaged in growing food or taking care of animals or hunting or foraging, right? That kind of knowledge has simply been eroded for so many people because they've been reduced to being food consumers, right? Shoppers of food that are, determined by the logics of commodification, efficiency, price, and so forth. What that means is we can't understand or fully appreciate what food is. And so the idea that we should cherish food, how is that going to happen? Right? I can cherish the salsa that is in my pantry when I've had some hand in growing tomatoes, recognizing that there's no guarantee that I will have tomatoes and therefore no guarantee that I'll be able to make salsa. But if food is so available as it is in our commodification world, we don't need to appreciate it because we just know it'll always be there. Right? So the conditions for cherishing depend upon proximity. They depend on a kind of intimacy, a kind of knowledge that alerts us to what I would call something like the mystery or the graciousness of the world in which we live. And our lives absolutely depend upon it, but our being positioned as consumers of the world means that we're going to be oblivious to it.
Yeah. Well, the consumer is secure, right? There's a security, there's a comfort, there's a convenience. All those words center around something such as control. I click, it arrives, I'm in control, I have a little bit of power, as you said. And the inverse of that, what you're mentioning, I mean, I've grown tomatoes and then not grown tomatoes some seasons, so you soon learn how steep the learning curve is of that of food growth is a key example. But the inverse of those consumerist traits are the ones which I would say are arguably linked to mystery, which is fragility, vulnerability, silence, openness, but specifically vulnerability. And it's all those, I think, as well, connects to the other sort of cornerstone of your book, which is love. Without all this, everything is you've outsourced anything that allows you a moment of openness and vulnerability where you no longer have a decision. You have to see something that is opposite to this very numb control.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And this is the thing. The danger when you bring up language of love, and one of the things I was wondering about as I was writing the book is how do I make sure that the love I'm talking about is not just sentimental, romantic love?
Oh, it's another word like hope that's been co-opted.
Yeah,
as a
right.
commodity.
And exactly. And the danger is that love is supposed to be easy. And this is, I think, what the whole technological allure is premised upon, the idea that we can live in a friction-free world. A world that is not going to put up resistance to us. And there's no question that technological platforms have enabled that to happen because if you just think about social media, you can have gazillion friends, but they're not ever going to be the kinds of friends who are going to challenge you, who are going to say, hold up here, you're being a total jerk right now. And that's not going to happen because you can just avoid them. You can unlike them or unfollow them or whatever. And so it gives us a world that is on our own terms. And the minute those terms become even a little bit objectionable, we just get off, we unplug or whatever, and go to the next device that is going to give us a world on our terms. And so to me, something like the metaverse that, that is being talked about is terrifying because now you can live in a world in which you set the terms for all of your engagement. And man, that is a truly terrifying prospect. And you know this personally. Everybody knows this because you can just as well imagine somebody says, I will be your friend until you present the slightest problem for me. Because as soon as you do, I'm walking away. You're going to say, well, then we're not friends. And that's exactly right. You're not friends, right? Friends become friends. The depth of their friendship grows insofar as they work through the difficulties, they work through the tensions so that they can still be with each other, be a source of support and care for each other in the midst of struggle and pain. And what technology promises is a world without struggle and pain.
I think it delivers it. But it's
it does.
It's already delivered it, but what it's delivered is a mass of numb thumb people. You just walk
Yeah.
around and
And people who are increasingly lonely, right? And that's the great
well,
paradox,
yeah,
I
because
think.
if you have no friction, you can't hold on to anything.
Exactly. Yeah.
Loneliness.
Yes. And
Everyone
that's
is
something that
everyone is
really,
absolutely digitally together, but they are individually
yeah. Yeah. And I think this is something that people they can sense when they have the opportunity to reflect on it. But the trouble is that we live in sort of built environments, but also within social, political, economic contexts and systems that just exacerbate the loneliness. Because if you just think about the fact that our sort of media world is driven by this desire to keep you unhappy, dissatisfied, ungrateful, to try to do something different is really, really difficult. And so people who want to have something different often feel they need to completely unplug from these platforms because they're distraction machines, they're rage machines, and they're basically insecurity machines because you get online and the first thing that you are presented with is how you are inadequate because you're not measuring up to what these other shiny people are clearly doing.
But I think, I mean, and this is something I've got another conversation coming up in a few weeks that's relating to this, actually, in relation to theology and horror. So this is something that's really on my mind, and I think it's very important. On the one side, what we're talking about with the hope, the quality of hope that you're talking about, with love, with vulnerability, you mentioned the word mystery. Let's just use that as the term for that side of things.
Right.
The other side of that is consumerism. And I think both of them state that they have an infinity. Both of them state that, but the consumerist infinity is let's say it's consumerist and it's transgressive. And the
Mhm.
limit of transgression is basically immediate. Sure, you've transgressed or you've consumed, but there's no actual beyond. You just keep doing that over and over and over and over again. So the infinity is like recursive, whereas there's no depth. Whereas mystery has an infinity that is genuinely eternal. It has a depth, and so my real optimism going into the future is, I think people are going to bore themselves out of numbness. People are getting bored of the phones. People, it's beginning to become transparent that no one is enjoying this anymore. I think the mechanism, the scrolling mechanism, people will now transparently say, I was just scrolling all night. So you saw, I think there's little cracks in the armor because how long can you eat the donut that you enjoy over and over and over again until you say, this isn't, I'm bored. Not this
Yeah.
isn't good for me. I'm bored of this.
Yeah.
I don't know if you agree.
Yeah.
Maybe you're more pessimistic than me.
No. That framing I think is really interesting. I would bring this sort of approach to it. And let's use food because you brought up donut because I like donuts. They're pretty good. But here's the thing about food. Historically, people have always known that you can only eat so much before you become full. But from a capitalist point of view, which wants to sell you more food because that's how they make their money, companies have now discovered that they can create foods that they taste really good, they feel really good in your mouth, but they are in principle undigestible, which means they'll pass through you.
No nutrition.
There's no
No
nutrition in them.
depth.
Exactly. And so this is the dream of a capitalist food system because now we can sell you an unending number of food products because they don't get digested by you. Now, if you're in that kind of a world and you're an eater of this food, you now understand that that food is being given to you, it's being sold to you solely so that you can be the source of somebody else's enrichment, right? The person producing this food, the person who engineered this food, they don't have your nutritional satisfaction at heart. They don't have your well-being at heart. The only thing they have at heart is how they can maximize the amount of product that they can now sell. It's just grown exponentially because people are never full. I think what people are realizing is not just that they're getting bored by this, but they're being taught again and again and again that you don't matter except insofar as you increase somebody else's bottom line. And they're beginning to feel more and more how they're being used by politicians, by leaders, by corporate executives, that really they don't give a rip about you. And I think this might also be part of the opening that we're going to need to see, where people understand that they are just being played by Silicon Valley executives. They're being, they're being sold false promises. They're being sold all kinds of stuff that does not exhibit cherishing, to use the word we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
Right? Consumers, after a while, begin to understand they don't really matter. And I think people want to know that they do matter. And so hope is going to depend upon us creating context, creating communities in which people can feel again that they matter, that the work that they do matters, and that they have an opportunity to contribute, not just to sort of the cherishing of themselves, but also the cherishing of the world that they live in. And the cherishing of the world that they live in requires that they commit to the healing and repair of it.
The first step towards real hope is to say, I've got enough. I'm content. Because you only really got one other option there, haven't you? Which is to do nothing or to be generous.
Yeah. 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 I mean, there's a kind of contentment that happens, or there's a kind of sense that, that I matter, right? That I am beloved. And so this is, I think, where a theological dimension comes in, where, if you think about traditions, indigenous religious traditions from around the world, one of the things that they often say is that this world is created. And there's a lot of ways that you can talk about this creation, but the basic thing to say about it is that the world, because it is created, reflects goodness and beauty. And that's just the starting assumption that gets made when you talk about the world as created. If you are a creature, that means you didn't have to exist, but you do. And the fact that you exist means that some creative power thinks it's good for you to exist. That's what gets it going right off the start. Because now you are not just some random cosmic accident that doesn't matter. No, you do matter because you're a creature.
People can try avoid that. They can try. I don't know if it sticks. I'm not going to try unfold all those arguments right now, but I'm not sure. I know I tried certainly for a while to be miserable and say I don't matter and everything's meaningless. But I think to even state that is to negate the thing you're stating, and to not want to deal with a form of vulnerability. It's to not want to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think it's easier to do that when you're in a situation, a physical situation of loneliness. But the minute you become involved in a world, you learn pretty quickly how you do matter, because you have a chance in your showing that others matter. You get to be a part of this larger affirmative project in which we value the goodness of our experiences, the goodness of the world around us, the goodness of the other people around us. And we can begin to see how simply by exercising a bit of love for others and for places, healing happens and flourishing happens. And I think I talk a little bit in the book about the importance of gardening, not because I expect everybody to become a professional gardener or a farmer, but simply participating in something as basic to the world's being, which is the growth of plants, right? It's fundamental to everything, right? To participate in that is to be confronted with the contingency of life and the potential beauty of life, right? Those are astounding things. And so that kind of, it's a physical, it's also emotional experience is really, really important, I think, to try to cultivate in people.
It's a very practical advice for people to begin to hope, is to go buy a houseplant.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be a big production, right? You don't need to put 10 acres under cultivation, but just committing to the care of a tomato or a spinach plant or something like that, you begin to understand something about the world's contingency, its fragility, but also its graciousness.
Is that how you would advise people to begin to hope? Do you have any other advice?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would start. I mean, it depends on the situation of people, right? I would say one of the things that you need to figure out in your own personal experience is how you are being nurtured by others. And that means, it could be how you're being nurtured by family or by friends or by a community or by a neighborhood, or there's just any number of ways that that can happen. And it's hard to do if you're by yourself, right? Sometimes it's best to be with other people who, in a process of mutual discovery, you can name for each other, right? Isn't it amazing how we feel better when there's sunshine? Or isn't it amazing how when we're in the presence of nature that we just feel better? Or isn't it amazing that when we're eating this food that the world tastes good? I mean, that ought to astound us, because it's just as easy to imagine that we live in a world that has no flavor, but it does, right? Or no fragrance or any of these sorts of things. And yet that's the kind of world that we're in. And so it's a matter of helping people return to a sense of their place in the world and how the world in which they live is actually a benefit to them, right? I mean, I mentioned in the book, Robin Kimmerer's observation that when Europeans came to North America, because they were so intent on possessing the land, they never allowed the land to demonstrate its love for them. And obviously, she's not meaning love in this romantic sense. She's meaning love in the sense that the land provides for us. And if you learn from the land to see how it does that provision, you're going to learn that you need to take care of it, because why would you abuse the very factors that make it possible for you to live and even flourish, right? That's a kind of idiocy. Now, we can see historically that a lot of people have chosen that idiocy, but at least if you're helping people come into the experience of that knowledge, that kind of understanding about how we are surrounded by gifts that when we receive them gratefully, they are utterly transformative of our lives, making our living possible.
That's your advice to readers? Be grateful for the unconditional gifts.
Yeah. Yeah. And the gifts are easily missed because of what we were talking about earlier, right? When you're on this relentless path, right? It's a soul destroying path and speedy path. You're just not going to notice that you're surrounded by gifts at all, because you're so intent on grasping the world that you're not able to receive it.
Well, in one direction, the simplest gifts become the best gifts, and in the other direction, no gift will ever suffice. You
Right.
always need a bigger gift.
Yeah. Yeah. And here too, this is interesting. I think this is one of the things that our younger people, I think, are really struggling with, is that they are seeing that the world that has been built around them is a world that often does not reflect that we really value the world, because the housing is awful. The school buildings are more like prisons than they are places of nurture, right? And the structures of our economy and politics, right? They're premised on polarization, normalizing hatred, right? All of these things are communicating to young people that this world isn't really being loved because it's not worthy of being loved. It's only worthy of being exploited. And that can be more or less extreme in the way people experience it, but it's really hard for young people to believe that they matter when so much of the world that's being constructed around them demonstrates not that they matter or that they're sort of gifts, but that everything is there to be used and abused. And then also abandoned, right? Abandonment is another big one.
Yeah. Used up, consumed, used up, abandoned, but abandoned in the same way we flush a toilet, right? Don't have to think about that now. Not even someone else's job. I don't even think about who's
Right.
got to deal with that, or the things I'm binning, or
Yeah.
whatever it might be. We've discussed your book in broad strokes. Is there anything key in the book that you feel you'd like to add in? Make sure that we touch upon.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things I wanted to do in the book is really highlight the importance of learning how to connect, how to come into the presence of others so that we can experience them and experience our places as worthy of cherishing. And by being worthy of cherishing, recognizing ourselves as valuable and as having agency in a world to affect its betterment, its healing, and so forth, But I also want to stress how hard that is to connect. And that's why in the book I have 2 chapters that deal with forgiveness. It's very easy for us to get relationships wrong. And so because of that fact, we need to constantly be prepared to acknowledge our wrongdoing and then commit to repairing the wrongdoing. And that's not a simple thing. It's not simple on 2 counts, right? So on the one hand is this personal need that many people feel to make themselves look better than they in fact are, right? Because who wants to acknowledge that they have made major errors in the way that they treat others or treat places? We don't want to do that because it's hard to acknowledge that we can do bad things. So that's the personal level, but there's also the cultural level, and we're living that right now here in America because we got people who, especially our leaders right now, who do not want to acknowledge the harm of America's history, right? There's talking about race is off the table. Talking about exploitation of women or exploitation of people that have traditionally been on the margins, right? Nobody wants to talk about it. Nobody wants to talk about the dispossession of land that happened for these indigenous communities, right? All of these things that are part of the American historical context, they're just being swept under the rug because we don't want to have to deal with the fact that this is a country that has done so much damage to its inhabitants. And then you can obviously extend it beyond America into the world itself. Well, how are we going to encourage the kind of reckoning, the kind of truth-telling that needs to happen in our personal histories, but also in our national histories? That's going to be a big job that needs to happen because, again, young people, they're very attuned to the injustices that they see in the world around them. And if we're not admitting the injustices, let alone trying to bring them into a place where we can analyze the injustice, how did it come to be, and then figure out a path forward. What are we going to do differently so that the afterlives of slavery and sexism and phobias of many, many kinds, if these are not going to just continue, perpetuate into the future, we're not going to address the things that are causing so much hopelessness for people.
It seems your book was very apt for the coming years then.
Well, I hope so. I mean, I certainly don't have predictive capacities, right? I don't know what's going to happen down the road, but we know enough to understand that it's going to be hard and it's not going to get easy all of a sudden, right? The idea that our hope rests upon some technological miracle that's going to fix it all, that's a fantasy. But I also want to say that the sort of religious version of it is also deeply destructive when we say, oh, we don't have to worry, because God's got this or something like that. I think that's also really destructive because what that does is it creates what I call, following a friend of mine, the ultimate bystander effect, where you can just sit back and relax because somebody else has got this. And I don't think anybody's got it. What we do have are communities of people who can be more or less attentive to what's happening, and therefore also more or less committed to addressing the things that are creating despair.
Hope for the future. Did writing this book, are you working on anything adjacent to this now? Did it open up any sort of ideas to continue from this book?
Yeah, it's odd. This is the first time in my life where I don't have a book project that I'm working on right now, and it's actually, I think, a really good time right now because in my position at Duke, in this office of climate and sustainability, I'm having opportunity to talk with lots of people from different disciplines, from health providers to engineers to lawyers to policy analysts to all kinds of folks. And what I really want to do in the next while is understand more how people think about the world from these different points of view. And I think the thing that, is especially of interest to me right now is that, it's pretty clear when thinking about climate change that we need to get some way to net zero so that we're not continuously pumping all these carbon products, whether CO2 or pumping up methane or whatever. We have to stop doing that because we're creating the conditions in which human civilizations aren't going to make it, at least not in the way that they are now. And so for me, the question is, what kind of a culture do we need to support something like a net zero economy? And that's huge because it's going to put on the table questions about what are the fundamental human desires that people have? How have those desires often gotten us into trouble? And how do we rethink, reframe, reorient our desires so that we can live in a world that is beautiful, that is clean, that is nutritious? Right? Those are the kinds of things that I think need to be the standards by which we judge success now. And it's not going to be GDP. It's not going to be about energy consumption, or it's not going to be about consumption of natural resources. Those can't be the indicators of success any longer. And so questions about enough, questions about success are going to be on the table for that kind of thinking.
And that's going to be a book, do you think?
Well, maybe. I don't know. We'll see. I'm not putting pressure on it right now. In the meantime,
No.
I just want to learn more from how other people think about these big questions, because I'm drawn to, the big questions. How do we think about them now that we see that some of the inherited ways of thinking about them often get us into a lot of trouble?
Mm. Well, unless there's anything you'd like to add, that seems like a good place to finish up.
No, that sounds good. It's been good talking with you, James.
I'll be sure to put the links for Love's Braided Dance, Hope in a Time of Crisis, in the description below. Anyone looking for a very accessible, very enjoyable read on hope, please be sure to check it out. And I'll put all other relevant links in the description below. But if that other idea becomes a book, I hope to talk to you about it down the line. So Norman Wirzba, thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks so much.